Nearly 4 billion years ago, life began in the roiling seas of planet Earth. Eons later, primitive single-celled organisms would give rise to life of stunning complexity. And the simple creature from which humans descended. As the global environment gradually changed, animals from sea and river ventured boldly onto land. If the entire history of life on Earth were condensed to a one-year time span, our human ancestors would have arrived in the final 13 minutes. And yet, mankind is already looking toward the new frontiers of our solar system. Summoning all the powers of science and technology within our reach, humans have even dreamed of terraforming Mars. Reshaping a distant planet to meet the future needs of our own species. Human beings are the first in Earth's evolutionary chain with the power to intentionally and profoundly alter the global ecology, and perhaps that of worlds beyond. It is widely believed that the first creature to walk upright lived 4 million years ago, a man-like ape from the vast forests of Africa. We may be its descendants. Earth's first hominids were ape-like in physique and behavior. But they would eventually acquire larger brains, a skeletal structure better adapted to their habitat, and the skills and intelligence to go with them. Hunter-gatherer societies made their way across land and water to every continent across the globe. "18,000 years ago, they had even reached Siberia and other parts of the Arctic Circle. At the time, the Earth was in the midst of an ice age. On the frozen plains of the Arctic, hunters followed the migrations of reindeer and other mammals. With global waters suspended as ice, the planet's tropical zones became drier. Rainforests were reduced to islands, and some species were driven to the edge of extinction by the climate, unlike their northern cousins. These are ancient spear tips. The design of these stone tools indicates that hunting techniques were already quite advanced. The world's oldest needle dates back 20,000 years. It was made of deer horn and was used for sewing skins to make clothing. By that time, man had acquired the know-how to survive the Arctic winters. Journeying across Eurasia, nomadic tribes made their way to its east coast and found a bridge to the New World. Glaciers formed during the Ice Age had absorbed huge amounts of water, causing sea levels to drop. A corridor between Siberia and Alaska was revealed, connecting the two continents. Little by little, global temperatures began to rise, and the glaciers blanketing the continent to melt. Some 12,000 years ago, the naked landscape left in their wake was covered with grassland and broadleaf and conifer forests. The Arizona State Museum exhibits artifacts from that period of North American history. Evidence shows that the continent was probably a temperate zone with an abundance of wildlife. These are the bones of a mammoth felled by a hunter. Still lodged in the animal's remains are the instruments of its demise, spearheads, and a number of other tools of stone. Proof that a group of hunters had risked their lives to fight this ancient behemoth. Dr. Paul Martin is a geologist with the University of Arizona. He believes that hunting almost completely wiped out North America's mammoths.
It's possible to envision a small number of people coming into Canada, Western Canada, some 11,500 years ago, and within a few hundred years only, spreading across most of North America, and in another few hundred years, spreading into South America. Now, this is a dramatic account. It may or may not be true, but it fits our chronology. The extinction of the large animals, the arrival of early people, and an event around 11,000 years ago as dated by radiocarbon.
Wild animals like the mammoth, bison, and saber-toothed cat had once been plentiful on the North American continent. But by the end of the Ice Age, almost 3/4 of these large mammals had gone extinct, some the quarry of ancient hunters. Humans pressed onward toward South America. According to Dr. Martin, it may have taken as few as several hundred years for man to reach Tierra del Fuego at the foot of the continent. The wind-swept landscape of Patagonia lies at the southern tip of Argentina. Sheltering themselves in these isolated caves, our ancestors left signs of their passing, paintings of animals that cover the walls. To subsist in this remote corner of the world would require acres of land and new skills.
the effect of the disappearance of large animals, the effect of the decline of animal resources, requires the people who have invaded this continent to master other kinds of material, such as plants, and in that regard, eventually we get to agriculture and another population increase. But the net effect of the colonization of the New World is a boom in population and then a crash as people are obliged to turn to other resources and learn how to harvest plants.
By this time, hunter-gatherer societies had established themselves across the globe. Anthropologists gauged that the total world population probably numbered at most between 5 and 10 million because of the nomadic lifestyle. But this trend was beginning to shift. On the Mediterranean coast of present-day Syria are signs of the changes underway. Scattered across the hillside are the ruins of ancient villages, some 10,000 years old or more. Since the dawn of mankind, our ancestors had been nomadic people. But evidence here tells a new story. This was a year-round settlement. These are vestiges of an ancient hearth. For cooking or warmth against the night chill, this structure of stone was the heart and gathering place of each dwelling.
At Abu Huraira, we were treading on a carpet of flints, flint tools that we picked up. We saw they dated from before the beginnings of pottery making in that part of the world. So we had a site that really was very early indeed in the story of village life in that part of the world.
Dr. Andrew Moore of Yale University says a number of factors determined why some societies adopted sedentary lifestyles. Climate was one.
20,000 years ago, temperatures were low, and in the Middle East it was also rather dry. But there would have been snow and glaciers in the mountains. And then beginning about 15,000 years ago, the climate began to improve. The temperature rose. It seems rainfall increased, and this allowed forest and grasslands to spread over the landscape. In those circumstances, hunting and gathering became very rich. Human populations increased, and for some people, like our first villagers at Abu Huraira in the Euphrates Valley, the hunting and gathering was so good in that area, they were able to settle down and to form a village.
In the wake of these climatic shifts, dry and desolate landscapes gave way to grasslands and forests. An environment where animals grazed and trees grew heavy with fruit. All year long, food was plentiful here. The lodgings were framed with poplar trees, the walls and roofs sealed with thatch. A typical village consisted of several clusters of such dwellings. In time, these villages would prosper, and their inhabitants assume a new social order.
When people are moving across the landscape in small bands of just 2 or 3 families, 10 or 20 people, they need very little in the way of social organization to run their affairs. But once they start to settle in villages, and the early villages like Abu Huraira had populations of 100 or 200 people, then they needed new forms of social organization. And we see them too starting to make fine objects. Big objects like grinding stones that they cannot carry around with them from campsite to campsite. So there are new crafts developing in these early villages before farming begins, and there are new ways of organizing society.
Dramatic changes were also afoot in the Western Hemisphere. The glaciers covering North America had been slowly retreating as temperatures rose. According to one theory, as the towering glaciers melted, once gentle rivulets became a fury of streams. Eventually, they converged into one site. The flow created a huge lake in the middle of the continent with an enormous reservoir of water, until the day the glaciers that had dammed the outflow collapsed. Torrents of water poured from the Great Lake, creating floods of epic proportion. The escaping waters swept across North America, eventually reaching the Atlantic Ocean. The crushing surge of fresh water covered the warm ocean current like a lid on a pot. Some scientists believe that this event may have triggered a new shift in global weather patterns. Evidence of Earth's grand climatic changes lies deep within the glaciers of the far north. A group of scientists from Copenhagen University has been studying these giants for more than a decade. In Greenland, ice that formed over the past 250,000 years has accumulated in blocks more than 1.5 miles thick. Sealed within are meteorological records of ancient weather patterns. By analyzing them, scientists may gauge with accuracy their historical effects. Buried far below the surface is 10,000-year-old ice. It's divided into distinct layers corresponding to years, like the rings of tree trunks. Locked in each layer is precise information about the ancient atmosphere. We know now that the planet's rising temperature suddenly dropped 11,000 years ago. It plummeted by nearly 20 degrees Fahrenheit, matching the coldest period of the Ice Age. This brief ice age affected not only Greenland, but the entire world, and lasted 1,000 years. In the Fertile Crescent, where man first settled, the thick forests and grasslands disappeared, creating dire food shortages.
I think had this change in climate occurred several thousand years earlier, it would not have been so disruptive. But by now, human populations had expanded quite considerably. So they were very dependent on rich hunting and gathering. And when that was no longer possible, when that was damaged, if you like, by this climatic reversal, they had to find a new way of life. So I think the beginnings of farming are the result of a climatic change, but they're also linked to growth in human population.
For hunter-gatherers used to seasons of plenty, solving the food crisis was a matter of survival and required a new way of thinking. As farming took hold as a lifestyle, communities could support more people. In the course of their research, Dr. Moore and his colleagues isolated more than 150 different species of plant seeds, all collected by the ancient settlers. Wild wheat, and legumes had appeared, hardy plants that could withstand severe climatic change. The International Research Center of Japanese Studies. Here, Dr. Yoshinori Yasuda analyzes the pollen culled by the ancient Syrian settlers. He can predict how the climate affected their environment. His samples include vast amounts of pollen from wheat, barley, and rice plants, survivors of the devastating ice age that had threatened their civilization. Cereal grasses abounded in the wooded uplands of the Fertile Crescent. Many of the plants were wild, but other apparently domesticated varieties were also discovered there. Dr. Yasuda believes that this pollen offers proof of a new human enterprise, agriculture, the science that would turn grains into a dietary staple.
1万1000年ぐらい前にこの寒の戻りがやってくるでしょ。
When the new ice age hit 11,000 years ago, it was no longer practical for people to rely on the forest for food.
草原にあるそういうイネ科の草本をね。
I believe that people then turned to cultivation, domesticating rice plants in the wild grasslands. The cold climate caused a food crisis, and humans were forced to make the shift towards agriculture.
Though the relentless cold had dealt them a serious blow, generations of settlers used their ingenuity to survive. Over the years, our ancestors sowed a variety of grain, learning through trial and error which would take to the landscape. The cereals harvested would be husked and ground for porridge or bread. One of the most successful grains was wheat. With the domestication of plants, humans would cease to be the product of natural selection. Instead, they would be the agents of growth and change, steering the direction of other species. Small enclaves of humanity would blossom into larger ones, and nomadic societies would dwindle as farming became a way of life. By cultivating the earth, humans gained more control over their food supply and relied less on the random gifts of nature. This simple act would revolutionize how society developed. Dr. George Wilcox of the Institute of Eastern Prehistory in France is studying how wild wheat becomes domesticated.
The relationship between man and cereals really developed into a symbiosis in that man became completely dependent on cereal cultivation because when his population reached a certain level, he would not be able to find enough food in the environment, and so he was totally dependent on this production economy of cereals. Looking at it from the other point of view, very rapidly the cereals evolved into plants which were incapable of reproducing themselves in the wild. And this is, we can see this quite simply because the ears stay intact after maturity and are left open to attack by birds and insects, whereas in the wild they will fall to the ground. And this is why domesticated cereals cannot really survive in the wild, and so they became completely dependent on man for their reproduction.
The wild wheat in the foreground is covered with a thick husk. The domesticated variety alongside is thinner, with a grain double its size. Cultivating crops for human consumption required experimentation. Dr. Wilcox believes that pre-agricultural societies already had tools conducive to farming, including the stone sickle. Discovered in Jordan, this harvesting tool is 10,000 years old. The handle was made of animal bone, to which a sharp stone blade was attached. Honed to perfection, it cut like a knife of steel.
This is what really changed the selection pressures. In the gathering stage, they would have sickles like this, but what they wouldn't do, of course, would be to sow. And the big change comes when they start sowing, and their economy becomes an economy of production. In other words, they can increase the quantity of grain needed for their population. And so that as the population increased, so would the production increase.
Farming and shepherding would spread to areas throughout the Fertile Crescent. Among them, the Beta site in the Jordan Rift Valley. Mortars of stone have been uncovered, tools to grind flour into wheat for bread baking. Agriculture created a demand for new goods and services. The mass production of food and the establishment of property required our ancestors to move a giant step away from their hunter-gatherer pasts. The development of agricultural societies was a turning point in human civilization. Up until about 10,000 years ago, the global population had leveled off, but with the rise of agriculture, it skyrocketed. 5,000 years ago, the Earth already supported 100 million people. The Ebla Palace in northern Syria. Built about 5,000 years ago, this ancient city was a major center of commerce and home to some 200,000 people. The bazaar at Ebla offered harvests from miles around. This is the oldest known library. It belonged to the king of Ebla. From the remnants of his library, 15,000 clay plates written in cuneiform were preserved. Most were business documents dealing with taxes, land ownership, and agricultural trade. This one lists wages paid in wheat. From these ancient records, it is clear that as agriculture became more productive, man was less concerned about his daily survival. Ornaments of gold reflect the material wealth of the kingdom and are signs of a higher culture with well-developed artistic expression. The evolution of agricultural societies opened another chapter in Earth's book of life, the birth of civilization. Along the banks of the Tigris and Euphrates in Egypt, and the river basins of the Indus. And in China, the first roots of civilization sprouted in the river paddies where a new crop called rice was being farmed. In central Syria, a mill built more than 1,000 years ago still functions today. Farmers depend on this ancient 90-foot workhorse to help irrigate the local crops. With the introduction of irrigation in cultivation, food production grew at an astounding rate. Powering the mill was a feat of engineering in its day. The harnessing of moving water required new technology. Many hundreds of years later, in the late 18th century, mechanical innovations would initially drive the Industrial Revolution. With the invention of the steam engine, the power available for human enterprise was staggering and would change the very rhythms of daily life. In the centuries that followed, humans would reach for even greater control over their environment, mining fossil fuels like coal and oil to exploit their energy. Within only a few generations, they would ransack a wealth of natural resources that had been accumulating for eons. And they would multiply in such great numbers to outpace every other species in history. Today, planet Earth supports about 5.5 billion Homo sapiens. Here in the peaceful New England countryside, the pressures of the human population explosion seem very remote. At the University of New Hampshire, Dr. Dennis Meadows runs a think tank that predicts future trends. His prognosis for humanity is bleak.
We see that the planet rather quickly loses the ability to feed everybody. Then, with the deterioration of the agricultural system, it becomes more and more difficult to sustain industrial growth. And finally, maybe in the period 2030 or 2050, the global population actually peaks and the death rate starts to go up and the population comes back down again to levels which can be fed.
Humans are now facing our limits to growth. Do we have the wisdom and the luck to overcome this crisis? Or will we fade to extinction like so many creatures before us? While we contemplate our future here on Earth, some futurists look to space as our next frontier. They dream of altering the ecology of Mars to sustain human life.
It's possible. It's scientifically possible. It's no longer in the realm of science fiction. But the question then is, should we restore Mars to habitable condition? I mean, we can, but should we? In some sense, human beings are the seeds that can take life from one planet to another planet and beyond, throughout the whole galaxy, because we are the only species that has the intelligence required to build the machines, to develop the technology, to spread life from beyond the Earth. And so one can view, in some sense, human beings as having a unique role and a unique charter among the organisms of Earth, which is to spread that life.
The average temperature on Mars is minus 80 degrees Fahrenheit, and its atmosphere very thin. Vast oceans of water lie buried under layers of polar ice. Releasing them is at the core of the plan to terraform Mars. Satellites equipped with huge reflecting mirrors would channel solar heat. As the ice caps began to melt, they would release vapor into the Martian atmosphere. An arsenal of technology would be deployed to terraform the planet. To speed the thaw, factories constructed there would emit greenhouse gases. The vapor would condense into rain and shower the Martian surface. Rivers would form, and the oceans of Mars would come to life. The plan optimistically estimates 100 years to create those oceans, and another 100,000 years to make Mars fit for human habitation. Replicating the steps of Earth's development, photosynthesizing bacteria would be released on the Martian surface, and then plants to produce oxygen. In time, the atmosphere on Mars might resemble our own. Eventually, this future world would support a Martian metropolis full of human colonists. If curiosity is a measure of intelligence, it is natural for humans to look beyond our horizon. Before we dare to design a new world, we would be wise to understand our own.
We will never fully understand ourselves or our Earth only by looking in. There's a certain requirement to look out, to compare ourselves to other worlds and to other futures. And I think Mars plays a key role there, in that it is the planet that's the most like Earth. And the technology that we've developed allows us to contemplate going to Mars, studying it, taking life there with us, and maybe even constructing a biosphere, terraforming Mars.
What exactly does it take to support life on Earth? To answer that question, scientists built a model here in the dusty Arizona desert. Called Biosphere 2, it was the first serious attempt to build an entirely closed and self-sustainable ecosystem. The Noah's Ark of the desert, Biosphere housed 3,800 different animal and plant species. The atmosphere inside was isolated from the world beyond its huge glass dome by airlocks. Plants would provide all necessary oxygen, and the habitat would be self-sufficient, requiring no supplies from the outside. Its bold design would be put to the test in September 1991 by 8 volunteers. They would live in the facility as part of an experiment studying the viability of the artificial ecosystem. For the next 2 years, they would be cut off from all physical contact with the outside world. they would have to survive on the crops they grew within the biosphere. At first, the experiment appeared to be running smoothly, but all too soon there was emergency, one of many that would plague the project. Linda Lay was in charge of the plants they depended on for food.
Our oxygen started to decline, and it declined to a point where it was difficult for us to breathe. We would take a few steps up a staircase and have to take a big breath because we would be out of breath. It was very difficult to live under those conditions, very difficult to do all of the work that we had to do in here to grow our own food and to maintain our systems with the shortage of oxygen.
The oxygen levels continued to fall, eventually registering dangerously low. Just where the gas was going within the sealed habitat puzzled scientists. To resolve the immediate crisis, they decided to boost the oxygen levels, pumping it in from the outside. In so doing, the parameters of the original experiment, a self-sustainable biosphere, were breached. But without the additional oxygen, the volunteers would not be able to survive. The source of the oxygen depletion continued to elude scientists, until at last they analyzed the composition of biosphere's soil. To their surprise, the earth inside the facility was absorbing the limited supply. Fresh, nutrient-rich soil had been spread throughout biosphere, providing an ideal environment for bacteria to grow. Bacteria also breathe oxygen. The scientists in charge had not accounted for this unexpected variable.
On Biosphere 1, on the Earth, we have a balance between the amount of oxygen that's produced by the plants and the amount of oxygen that's consumed by the microbes in the soils. And this is fairly stable on the Earth. Well, in Biosphere 2, it's not stable. And in fact, there is more consumption of oxygen by the microbes in the soil than there is production of oxygen by the plants. Our oxygen was going into the soils. Well, another part of that, which is not a biological process, is that when oxygen is consumed by the soil produces carbon dioxide. And were we to see that in our atmosphere, we would have known that it was a soil problem, but we did not see this buildup of carbon dioxide because the concrete was absorbing the carbon dioxide. So we had, first of all, a biological process, which was an imbalance of production and consumption of oxygen, and then a sequestering of carbon dioxide by the concrete.
So seamless is the order of the natural world that we underestimate its complexity. Perhaps this is a lesson of Biosphere 2. Shaped over billions of years, Earth's changing ecosystems determine what will grow here. Grasping the nuances of their fragile balance could take many human lifetimes. Until we understand this planet of life, dare we contemplate the shaping of distant worlds?
By considering how to build a biosphere on Mars, we will learn a lot about how our biosphere works and about how to take care of our biosphere and how to prevent it from failure, which would be a real disaster if we don't manage it properly. And whether we like it or not, human beings have to become the managers of the biosphere. We have such an impact on the biosphere that we can no longer allow it to take care of itself. We have to start deciding what we're going to do and how we're going to manage it. And so we have to learn a lot more about biospheres than we know right now.
In the 20th century, man first ventured into outer space. From his vantage point on high, the Earth was a breathtaking sight. Brilliant blue skies framed islands of life below. And for one unparalleled moment, all humankind marveled with gratitude at the extraordinary place we call home. If we are to continue our journey on Earth, we must find the wisdom to change, or perhaps cede our place to the next in the evolutionary line.